The mission is critical. We launch at dawn. Any deviation will compromise the entire fleet. Stay focused.
All the conquerors in Taishes, Jinchopri, Wadasta!
300 heavily armored warships of the Draken Empire hung in the freezing void of space. Their hulls were pristine, forged from dark alloys that drank the starlight line with glowing ports of plasma weaponry that hummed with the promise of absolute destruction. They were a fleet of conquest and armada that had reduced dozens of star systems to ash in memory. Standing against them, forming a thin, ragged line in the dark, were 37 ships of Earth. They were not warships. They were retrofitted cargo haulers, scarred mining vessels, and bulk freighters. Their hulls were a patchwork of rusted iron, mismatched plating, and exposed wiring. They looked less like a defensive blockade and more like a floating graveyard. Behind that pathetic line of flying scrap metal sat the blue marble of Earth. 8 billion human beings went about their days largely unaware that the sky above them was poised to burn. 8 billion mothers, fathers, and children. 8 billion souls with nowhere left to run. The Draken Empire looked at those 37 rusted ships and saw a joke. They saw a primitive species begging for enslavement. They saw an obstacle that would be swept away in a matter of seconds. Or so they thought. The road to this silent standoff in the dark had begun exactly 3 weeks earlier in the towering crystalline halls of the Galactic Council. Ambassador Zale of the Altari Federation had stood before the assembly of 47 alien species. Zale was a creature of peace, a diplomat who had spent his life bringing new worlds into the fold of galactic harmony. But on that day, Zale's hands had trembled. His voice had cracked. He had not come to introduce a new ally. He had come to issue a warning. He projected a holographic display into the center of the Great Hall. The image of a blue and green planet materialized, swirling with white clouds. They call themselves humans. Zale had whispered the translation matrix, carrying the dread in his voice to every corner of the chamber. And they are a nightmare, the council had murmured. General Vorg, the massive scar-covered infantry commander of the Draken Empire, had laughed from his podium. His reptilian eyes had narrowed with predatory amusement. To the Draken, the galaxy was a hunting ground. A new species merely meant fresh slaves and unplundered resources. What threat could primitives possibly pose to us? General Vorg had scoffed, his deep voice rattling the glass fixtures. Do they possess plasma cannons? Do they have energy shields? Our scouts report they still rely on chemical combustion just to leave their atmosphere. They are insects. Ambassador Zale had shaken his head slowly, his eyes wide with a terror the council could not comprehend. You do not understand. It is not their technology that makes them dangerous. It is their minds. They do not fight to conquer, General. They fight because war is the anvil upon which their entire civilization was forged. Zale shifted the hologram. The tranquil image of Earth vanished, replaced by a rapid succession of historical archives. The council watched in mounting horror. They saw legions of men in bronze armor, clashing in muddy fields, driving iron through flesh. They saw wooden ships tearing each other apart with primitive ballistics. They saw vast trenches filled with poison gas and barbed wire where millions of young men died over yards of shattered earth. And then the hologram flared with blinding, terrible light. The mushroom clouds. The atoms split and weaponized. They unlocked the fundamental building blocks of the universe. Zale said, his voice dropping to an urgent hush. And the very first thing they did with that knowledge was build a bomb to drop on their own people. Silence had fallen over the Grand Hall. Even the most hardened warrior species felt a chill crawl down their spines. They have fought for 5,000 years. Zale continued pleading with the silent room. They study war. They analyze every defeat. They turn slaughter into mathematics. They are not mindless beasts. They are calculating, relentless, and they have never known a century of true peace. I beg you, leave them alone. Do not provoke them. High above the assembly, lounging on a throne of carved obsidian, Emperor Moros of the Draken Empire leaned forward. He was a colossal being, his dark red scales bearing the marks of 100 personal conquests. He did not feel fear. He felt only the insult of being told what not to do. 5,000 years of fighting each other, Emperor Moros rumbled, his voice like grinding tectonic plates. And yet they still dwell in the mud. They are savages. The Emperor turned his heavy gaze to a younger officer standing at attention beside the throne, Admiral Vane. Vane was brilliant, ambitious, and entirely unacquainted with failure. He had broken 3-star systems in the name of the Empire. He was hungry for a fourth. Admiral Vane, the Emperor commanded, take the Vanguard fleet, 300 ships, break their pathetic orbital defenses, burn their capitals. Bring me their leaders in chains. The Draken Empire does not cower before ghosts. It will be done, my Emperor, Vane had smiled, a matter of days. And now, 3 weeks later, Admiral Vane sat in the command chair of his flagship, the Dreadnought Annihilator. He stared at the forward view screen, looking at the 37 rusty hulks floating in the void. Vane sneered. It was even more pathetic than the intelligence reports had suggested. On the bridge of the human flagship, the reality of the situation was entirely different. The ship was designated the Aegis. Outwardly, it looked like a deep space ore hauler that had seen 30 years of hard labor in the asteroid belt. Its hull was bulky, ungainly, and completely devoid of visible weapon ports. Inside the bridge was cramped, lit by the harsh red glow of tactical monitors. It smelled of ozone, recycled air, and the bitter tang of stale coffee. There was no panic. There was only the quiet, rhythmic hum of machinery and the low voices of officers calling out telemetry. Sitting in the center chair was Captain Silas Thorne. Thorne was 45 years old. The hair at his temples had turned the color of cold steel. He wore a faded standard-issue naval uniform. He did not look like a hero. He looked like a man who had worked a difficult, thankless job for a very long time and expected to do so for a little while longer. Thorne held a battered ceramic mug in his right hand. He took a slow sip of black coffee. His eyes never left the tactical display. 300 massive red contacts pulsed on the screen. 37 small blue ones stood in their way. Captain, the communications officer said softly. She was young, barely out of the academy, but her voice held steady. We are being hailed. Wideband transmission. It's the enemy commander. Put him on, Thorne said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Every soul on the bridge was hanging on his every word. The main screen flickered. The image of Admiral Vane appeared. The alien commander sat in a chair of gleaming metal, surrounded by a bridge crew that looked more like a royal court than a military unit. Vane's yellow eyes locked onto the camera. He looked at the dim, cramped bridge of the Aegis, at the simple uniforms, at the older man holding a coffee mug. Vane's lips curled into a smile of pure contempt. I am Admiral Vane of the Draken Empire, the alien declared, his voice booming through the speakers with engineered acoustic dominance. You are standing in the path of the Imperial Armada. By the decree of Emperor Moros, this system and all its resources are now the property of the throne. Vane leaned closer to the screen, his yellow eyes narrowing. You have 30 seconds to power down your engines and prepare for boarding. Any resistance will be met with immediate and total vaporization. Do not die for nothing human. The bridge of the Aegis was dead silent. The young communications officer looked back at Thorne. The helmsman's hands tightened on the yoke. Every crew member knew the mathematics. 300 to 37. Silas Thorne took another sip of his coffee. He set the mug down on the console with a soft, definitive clink. He stood up slowly, smoothing the front of his jacket, and stepped into the light of the holocam. He looked directly into Vane's eyes. He did not blink. This is Captain Silas Thorne of the Earth Defense Fleet, Thorne said. His voice was calm. It held no anger. It held no fear. It was the voice of a man stating an undeniable fact of nature. You have crossed into sovereign territory with hostile intent. We do not care about your emperor. We do not care about your empire. Thorne paused. He leaned forward, resting his hands on the communications console. You have exactly 10 minutes to turn your fleet around and go back to wherever it is you came from. If you do not, we will be forced to defend our home. On the view screen, Vane stared in blank disbelief. Then a harsh, barking laugh erupted from the Draken Admiral's throat. His bridge crew joined in a chorus of mocking, cruel amusement. Defend yourselves, Vane chuckled, wiping a tear of mirth from his scaled cheek. With what Captain Thorne you command a fleet of garbage scows. You do not even possess energy shields. You are nothing. Thorn's expression did not change. You have 9 minutes and 30 seconds. I will enjoy watching your world burn, Vane snarled. He slashed a hand across his throat. The communication channel went dead. The screen returned to the tactical map. The countdown began. 9 minutes. On the Aegis, the crew moved with practiced mechanical precision. There was no frantic shouting. There were only quiet confirmations of systems locking into place. Power routing to primary deflectors, the engineering officer reported. Targeting matrices synced with the flotilla, weapons control chimed in. Thorn stood by his chair, his hands clasped behind his back. He watched the red dots on the screen. He knew what was coming. The enemy would not wait 10 minutes. Arrogance never possessed patience. Brace for impact, Thorn said quietly. On the Draken flagship, Admiral Vane did not hesitate. He wanted to make a point. He wanted to break the human spirit before the real invasion even began. Target the human flagship, Vane ordered, his voice cold and sharp. Maximum yield on the main plasma battery. Melt them to slag. Let the rest of their pathetic fleet watch. The bow of the Annihilator began to glow. Searing, blinding blue light gathered in the focal rings of the Dreadnought's primary cannon. It was a weapon designed to crack continental plates. It fired with a soundless flash that temporarily overwhelmed the optical sensors of every ship in the sector. A beam of pure incandescent plasma lanced across the void, striking the Aegis dead center. On the Draken bridge, Vane smirked, waiting for the expanding fireball of expanding gases and shattered metal. He waited for the human flagship to be erased from existence. But the light faded, the smoke cleared, and the Aegis was still there. Vane leaned forward, his claws gripping the armrests of his chair. What is this sensor malfunction report? Sensors are functioning perfectly, Admiral, the Draken science officer stammered, his hands flying across his holographic console. Direct hit confirmed, but the energy was absorbed. On the Aegis, the impact had violently shaken the deck, but the crew remained at their stations. The outer layer of the ship's rusted hull, the fake cosmetic plating designed to look like a civilian freighter, had been burned away by the plasma beam. Beneath it, the true skin of the Aegis was revealed. It was a lattice of gleaming, hyperdense carbon plating pulsing with a deep, rhythmic blue light. The humans did not use static energy bubbles like the rest of the galaxy. They used kinetic absorption shielding. The harder they were hit, the stronger the shield became, feeding the enemy's own energy directly into their reactor cores. Earth had not sent freighters to hold the line. They had sent apex predators wearing the skins of dead sheep. Shield capacity at 120%. The Aegis engineering officer reported, a grim satisfaction in her voice. Their weapon just charged our primary drives. Silas Thorn did not smile. He simply nodded. 10 minutes are up. Weapons free. Show them who we are. The 37 Earthships moved. They did not fly in rigid, majestic formations like the Draken. They broke apart, scattering like a school of deep-sea predators. Their thrusters burned with a violent, savage intensity. All forward batteries fire, Vane screamed, panic finally edging into his voice. Wipe them out. The space between the two fleets erupted in a storm of plasma fire and energy torpedoes. The Draken fleet unleashed a barrage that would have leveled a planetary hemisphere. But the human ships danced through the fire. They moved with a chaotic, unpredictable rhythm that the Draken targeting computers simply could not track. And then the humans fired back. They did not use energy weapons. They did not use plasma. They used the oldest, simplest concept in the history of human warfare. They threw a rock very, very fast. Magnetic rails running the length of the human ships ignited. Massive slugs of depleted uranium and tungsten were accelerated to significant fractions of the speed of light. When a slug moving at that velocity strikes a target, mass and armor become entirely irrelevant. The Draken energy shields designed to deflect plasma and lasers offered absolutely no resistance to pure kinetic mass. The human artillery struck the Draken vanguard. It was devastating. It was instantaneous. 3 Draken dreadnought ships that had terrorized the galaxy for centuries were quite literally punched in half. The tungsten slugs cored through their heavily armored hulls from bow to stern, exiting the rear engines and leaving gaping glowing holes of shattered metal and venting atmosphere. "Hull breaches on the Vanguard, the Bloodlet, and the Iron Crown," the Draken tactical officer shrieked. "They're gone, Admiral. They're just gone." Vane stared in absolute horror as the wreckage of his invulnerable ships drifted apart. "Impossible. Return fire. Swarm them with fighters." Thousands of Draken fighter craft poured from the hangar bays of the carrier ships, swarming toward the human lines like angry insects. But the human fleet did not retreat. They tightened their formation, interlinking their point defense networks. A wall of automated flak and proximity detonating shrapnel filled the void, shredding the Draken fighters before they could even get into firing range. The battle descended into chaos. The Draken fleet was massive, but it was sluggish. It relied on overwhelming frontal firepower. The humans fought like knife fighters in a dark alley. They slipped beneath the firing arcs of the heavy cannons. They targeted engines, life support systems, and command bridges with ruthless surgical precision. But the numbers were still 300 to 37. A human destroyer, the Corsair, was caught in a crossfire between two Draken battleships. Its kinetic shields glowed blindingly white as they absorbed massive amounts of punishment, but eventually the lattice overloaded. The shield shattered. A plasma torpedo struck the Corsair's aft quarter, obliterating its main engines. On the bridge of the Aegis, Thorn watched the Corsair vent atmosphere on his tactical monitor. "Captain," the comms officer said, her voice tight. "Transmission from the Corsair. It's Commander Hayes. He's bleeding heavily. Main power is gone. Life support is failing." Thorn gripped the edge of his console. He knew the man. They had served together for 20 years. "Put him through to my headset." The voice of Commander Hayes crackled in Thorn's ear. It was wet, ragged, but completely devoid of panic. "Silas," Hayes coughed, "we've lost containment on the reactor. We have maybe 3 minutes before we cook from the inside out." "I see it, John," Thorn said quietly. He did not offer empty comfort. He did not tell him help was on the way. They both knew there was no help. "The Draken flagship is sitting directly in front of us," Hayes said. The sound of alarms blared in the background. "They think we're dead in the water. They dropped their forward shields to route power to their main cannon to finish us off." Thorn closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. He knew what Hayes was asking. He knew the cost. "Do what you have to do, John. It's been an honor." "Give 'em hell, Silas," Hayes whispered. The channel clicked off. On the battlefield, the crippled, burning hull of the Corsair suddenly shifted. Its conventional engines were dead, but its faster-than-light drive, the experimental hyperspool matrix that humans had only recently perfected, was still intact. The Corsair did not calculate a jump coordinate. It did not aim for the safety of deep space. It aimed the nose of the ship directly at the armored bridge of the Draken flagship, the Annihilator. And Commander Hayes engaged the FTL drive. A ship cannot instantly jump to faster-than-light speeds. There is a microsecond where it exists in real space, accelerating at an exponential rate. When a mass of several thousand tons hits a solid object at 99%, the speed of light, it does not act like a collision. It acts like a localized supernova. The Corsair vanished in a streak of distorted light. An instant later, the Draken flagship ceased to exist. There was no explosion. There was simply a blinding, silent flash that whited out the viewports of every ship for thousands of miles. The Annihilator, along with its escorts, its thousands of crew members, and its impenetrable armor, was instantly converted into a cloud of expanding, superheated atoms. The shockwave rippled outward, tossing Draken cruisers like toys in a hurricane. Admiral Vane, who had been commanding from a secondary dreadnought further back in the formation, was thrown to the deck as his ship violently shuddered. He scrambled to his feet, blood dripping from his scaled forehead, and stared at the view screen. Where his mighty flagship had been, there was only a glowing, expanding nebula of vaporized metal. Panic, pure and primal, seized the Draken fleet. They were warriors accustomed to bullying weaker species. They were entirely unequipped to fight an enemy that would willingly turn their own ships into weapons of mass destruction. The Draken formation shattered. Captains began breaking ranks, turning their massive ships around, desperate to escape the slaughter. "Retreat!" Vane screamed, his voice cracking with terror. "All ships initiate jump sequence. Get us out of here!" One by one, the surviving Draken vessels tore holes in space-time and fled back into the hyperspace lanes, leaving their dead behind. In less than 20 minutes, the engagement was over. 75 Draken warships lay in burning ruins across the void. The human line held. Only 36 ships remained. On the bridge of the Aegis, the red tactical lights faded back to a calm, steady blue. The crew slumped in their chairs, exhaling breaths they didn't realize they had been holding. The silence was absolute. Silas Thorne walked slowly back to his command chair. He picked up his battered ceramic mug. The coffee was cold. He poured it onto the grated deck, walked over to the ancient percolator, bolted to the bulkhead, and poured himself a second cup. He looked out at the burning wreckage of the alien fleet. He looked at the empty space where the Corsair had been. Damage control teams report, Thorne said, his voice steady. Comms send a burst transmission to high command. Tell them the Vanguard is broken. But tell them to get ready. The Empire won't let this stand. Thorne took a sip of the bitter hot coffee. He knew the truth. This was not a victory. It was merely the ringing of the bell. Far away back on the blue marble of Earth, the transmission reached its destination. It did not go to a shiny skyscraper in a bustling metropolis. It went deep underground. Hundreds of feet beneath the solid granite of Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado, behind blast doors that weighed 50 tons, lay the nerve center of the Earth Defense Fleet. The room was vast, cavernous, and bathed in the cool light of massive holographic war maps. Dozens of analysts, technicians, and strategists moved with hushed urgency. Standing on the central command dais was General Harlan Vance. Vance was 68 years old. He stood tall, his posture rigid, his uniform immaculate. His face was a map of deep lines carved by decades of service, by wars fought in the shadows, by the heavy burden of command. He did not possess the luxury of youthful optimism. He knew exactly what humanity was capable of, both its greatest heroism and its most terrifying darkness. Vance stood with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the tactical replay of the battle at the edge of the solar system. He watched the Corsair sacrifice itself. He watched the Draken fleet run. General, a senior aide said, stepping up to the dais. The man looked pale. Captain Thorne's report is confirmed. The enemy Vanguard is destroyed. We held the line. Vance did not celebrate. His steely gray eyes remained fixed on the holographic map of the solar system. We gave them a bloody nose, Colonel. Vance said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that commanded instant respect. We humiliated them. An empire built on arrogance cannot survive humiliation. They will not send 300 ships next time. They will send everything they have. Vance slowly turned away from the screen and walked over to a heavy, secure console at the edge of the dais. He unlocked a biometric panel. The Galactic Council warned them, Vance murmured almost to himself. They told them we were dangerous. They told them we spent 5,000 years perfecting the art of killing. Vance inserted a physical key into the console and turned it. Across the tactical map, the solar system began to change. They thought they were attacking a primitive world, Vance said, his voice hardening into steel. On the map, thousands of hidden blips suddenly flared to life, deep within the craters of the moon, buried beneath the red dust of Mars. Submerged in the freezing oceans of Europa, hidden among the tumbling rocks of the asteroid belt, massive automated foundries spun up. Orbital railguns disguised as dead satellites powered their capacitors. Millions of proximity mines drifting silently in the dark armed their warheads. Earth had not been idle since humanity had learned they were not alone. They had not built a fleet to conquer the stars. They had spent decades turning their entire solar system into a fortress. Every rock, every moon, every dead world was a weapon waiting to be drawn. General Vance looked at the map, now glowing with the terrifying lethal ingenuity of the human race. They think Earth is prey, Vance said softly, looking up into the dark ceiling of the bunker. They just walked into a slaughterhouse. The Draken Empire did not understand defeat. For 1,000 years, their history had been written in a single and changing direction outward. They expanded. They conquered. They consumed. When a species resisted, the Empire did not negotiate. It simply applied more pressure until the resistance snapped. Deep within the obsidian walls of the Imperial Palace on Draka Prime, Emperor Moros sat upon a throne forged from the melted armor of vanquished kings. He was a mountain of muscle and dark red scales, a being who ruled not by divine right, but by the sheer undeniable mathematics of violence. Before him, kneeling on the cold stone floor, was Admiral Vane. Vane was trembling. His uniform was scorched. His pride was shattered. He had limped back to the capital with only a fraction of his vanguard, leaving 75 warships burning in the void of an unmapped, primitive solar system. They used their own ship as a bomb, my Emperor Stin, Vane whispered, his voice echoing in the vast silent chamber. They do not fight with honor. They fight like cornered animals. They bent the laws of physics just to break our line. Emperor Moros did not yell. He did not fly into a rage. He simply leaned forward in the heavy chains of his ceremonial armor clinking in the quiet room. You were sent to swat a fly admiral, Moros rumbled, a sound like shifting tectonic plates. And you returned to tell me the fly has broken your hand. General Vorg, the massive commander of the Draken ground forces, stepped out from the shadows beside the throne. Vorg's face was a ruin of old scars. He looked at Vane with unvarnished disgust. The Navy grows soft, Vorg sneered. You let a handful of trash haulers outmaneuver you. Give me the order, my Emperor. Let me take the infantry. I will march across their blue world and pave their cities with the bones of their children. Emperor Moros raised a massive clawed hand. The room fell dead silent. No, Moros said softly. The time for vanguard actions is over. They have insulted the Empire. They have made us bleed. For this, their entire species will be erased from the galactic record. Moros stood. His shadow fell across the kneeling admiral. Mobilize the Grand Armada, the Emperor commanded. 800 ships. Take every dreadnought. Take every siege carrier. Do not ask for their surrender. Do not accept it if it is offered. Turn their world to glass. 6 days later, the fabric of space-time at the edge of the Sol system tore open. It did not open in a single localized flash. The rupture spanned thousands of kilometers, a bleeding wound in the dark. From that wound poured the full terrifying might of the Draken Empire. 800 warships. They moved in perfect rigid formation. Heavy battleships formed the armored core, their plasma cannons already glowing with charged energy. Swarms of fighter carriers flanked them, while massive orbital bombardment platforms trailed behind, dragging their enormous mass through the vacuum. Admiral Vane stood on the bridge of his new flagship, the Eclipse. He wanted blood. He wanted to see Captain Silas Thorne's rusted ship break apart under a concentrated barrage. Sensors, Vane snapped. Locate the human fleet. Where are they hiding? The Draken sensor officer stared at his holographic displays. He tapped the console. He refreshed the sweep. A cold sweat broke out over his scales. Admiral, the officer said, his voice tight, there is nothing. What do you mean nothing? They had 36 ships remaining. Find them. Sir, the sector is empty. They are gone. There are no energy signatures, no thermal blooms, nothing between us and their home world but empty space and rocks. Vane narrowed his eyes. He looked at the main view screen. The Sol system lay open before them. The blue jewel of Earth hung in the distance, utterly unprotected. They ran, General Vorg laughed, his voice crackling over the fleet-wide comms from his troop transport. The primitives finally realized what they were facing. They abandoned their post. Vane wasn't smiling. He remembered the cold, dead look in Captain Thorne's eyes. He remembered the human ship that had immolated itself just to kill his flagship. Men like that did not run. Maintain formation, Vane ordered cautiously. Advance toward the inner system. Maximum shields. Keep your targeting arrays locked on the asteroid belt. If they are hiding in the debris, I want them flushed out. The massive Draken Armada moved forward, a tidal wave of dark metal sliding into the graveyard of the outer system. They crossed the threshold of the asteroid belt, navigating the tumbling chunks of ancient rock and ice. It was perfectly quiet. Back on Earth, buried beneath millions of tons of granite in Cheyenne Mountain, General Harlan Vance watched the red dots swarm his tactical board. 800 contacts. The board was practically bleeding. The command center was dead silent. Dozens of analysts watched the screens, their breathing shallow. Vance stood with his hands locked behind his back. He did not sweat. He did not pace. He possessed the icy calm of a man who had already made his peace with the devil. He watched the Draken fleet cross the invisible line he had drawn on his map. They were deep inside the belt. They were surrounded. Vance leaned over the comms console. Execute Phase 2. In the vacuum of space, the Draken fleet detected the energy spikes a fraction of a second before the trap sprang. Massive power surges detected, The Draken's science officer screamed. All around us, they aren't ships, it's the asteroids. They had assumed the human mining installations scattered across the belt were civilian infrastructure. They assumed the massive ungainly machines clamped to the surface of the asteroids were used to extract iron and silicate. They were wrong. When humanity learned they were not alone in the dark, they did not just build a fleet. They weaponized their own solar system. The mining outposts were not just extracting ore. They were processing it, refining it, and loading it into the chambers of the largest kinetic mass drivers ever conceived. Thousands of dead rocks suddenly flared with blue light. There was no sound in the vacuum, only the blinding flash of magnetic rails discharging. Millions of tons of processed hyperdense iron slag were fired simultaneously. The projectiles were not aimed. They didn't need to be. The Draken fleet was flying in a tight, arrogant formation. The human trap did not just fire into the fleet, it fired around them. The first volley of kinetic slugs tore through the outer edges of the Draken formation. Battleships were shredded like wet paper. Energy shields designed to stop plasma offered zero resistance to 1,000-ton boulders moving at relativistic speeds. Evasive maneuvers, Vane roared the deck of the Eclipse, heaving violently as a kinetic slug clipped their port nacelle. Break formation, get us clear of the kill zone. But they couldn't. That was the genius of Harlan Vance's design. The mass drivers were firing in a calculated mathematical grid. They were not just trying to hit the Draken ships, they were hurting them. Every time the Draken fleet tried to scatter, a new volley of high-speed iron forced them back toward the center. "They are boxing us in," General Vorg yelled over the comms, his troop transports taking heavy fire. "Admiral, do something, our armor cannot stop this." Vane looked at the tactical map. It was a nightmare. The human crossfire was perfectly synchronized. They were trapped in a cosmic meat grinder. But Vane was not a fool. He saw the flaw in the human design. The mass drivers were stationary. They were bolted to the rocks. "All ships, maximum vertical thrust," Vane commanded. "Push up, get above the orbital plane of the belt. They cannot track us if we leave the ecliptic." The Draken fleet surged upward, their massive engines burning white-hot as they desperately clawed their way out of the asteroid field. They took brutal losses. Nearly 150 ships were left behind, their shattered hulls tumbling silently among the rocks they had underestimated. As the surviving armada broke clear of the asteroid belt, panting and bleeding, heavy silence fell over the Draken comms network. Vane gripped on the edge of his console. His chest heaved. He had survived, but he had been outplayed. Again. "Admiral," General Vorg's voice came through thick with fury. "We cannot advance on their homeworld like this. If they have orbital defenses like that around Earth, they will tear us to pieces before we can drop a single soldier." Vane knew Vorg was right. The human defenses were too deeply entrenched. To break Earth, they needed to break humanity's spirit first. They needed to force the humans to come out of their bunkers and fight in the open. Vane looked at the system map. He saw the human colonies. "Sensors give me readings on their off-world settlements. Mars and Europa." "Scanning," the officer replied. "Minimal military presence detected. Massive civilian infrastructure. Heat signatures indicate millions of inhabitants in subterranean dome cities. They are soft targets, Admiral." Vane's lips curled into a vicious, ragged smile. "They want to play games in the dark," Vane said coldly. "Let us see how clever they are when we start slaughtering their people." "General Vorg, take your legions. I will provide orbital cover. Drop on Mars and Europa. Burn the colonies. Leave no survivors." General Vorg laughed. It was an ugly, guttural sound. "With pleasure, Admiral. It is time these humans learned what war truly is." The Draken armada split. 300 ships angled toward the red, dusty sphere of Mars. The remaining fleet moved toward the frozen, cracked surface of Jupiter's moon Europa. They were going to make the humans watch their children die. In the Cheyenne Mountain complex, the shift in the Draken fleet's trajectory triggered a cascade of red warning lights. "General Vance," the lead analyst called out, his voice tight. "The enemy fleet is breaking. They are ignoring Earth. They're vectoring toward the Martian colonies and the European ice mines. Estimated time of arrival, 4 hours." Vance stood perfectly still. He did not gasp. He did not order a frantic scramble of rescue ships. He just stared at the board. General, the analyst urged. There are 12 million civilians in the new Ares colony on Mars, another 4 million on Europa. Should we deploy the fleet to intercept? Vance slowly turned to look at the young analyst. Deploy the fleet. Sun Captain Thorne has 36 ships left. If I send him out there, Vane will wipe him out and then glass the colonies anyway. But sir, the civilians are exactly where they need to be, Vance said softly. His eyes were cold, hard flint. Let them land. 4 hours later, the Draken dropships breached the thin, rusty atmosphere of Mars. General Vorg stood in the Vanguard transport strapped into his heavy assault armor. He held a massive plasma repeater rifle across his chest. Behind him, thousands of Draken shock troops checked their weapons, their eyes wide with bloodlust. They had taken a beating in the void. Now it was their turn. They were going to unleash hell on the soft, unarmored flesh of the human colonists. The transports descended through the red haze, settling down on the flat, barren plains, just outside the primary dome of New Ares. The ramps dropped. Thousands of Draken soldiers poured out onto the red dirt, weapons raised, screaming their battle cries. They formed up a tidal wave of armored scales and plasma rifles ready to breach the colony walls. General Vorg stepped off the ramp, his boots crunching in the Martian soil. He looked at the massive glass and steel dome of the human city. It was silent. There were no defense turrets firing. There were no human soldiers manning the barricades. There was no panic, no screaming, no movement. Vorg frowned. He activated his helmet's thermal optics. He scanned the dome. General, his lieutenant said, confusion bleeding into his voice. The city, it's empty. There are no thermal signatures inside the habitation zones. The life support systems are running on minimum standby. Vorg marched forward, kicking through the dust. Impossible. We tracked millions of life signs just hours ago. Where did they go? Humans cannot just vanish. He looked around. The only structures outside the dome were the massive, sprawling industrial complexes. Autonomous mining rigs, colossal ore crushers, and deep-core drilling platforms. They were silent, dormant behemoths of human engineering. Suddenly, a low, rhythmic thumping sound vibrated through the soles of Vorg's boots. It wasn't coming from the sky. It was coming from beneath the dirt. Inside Cheyenne Mountain, General Vance pressed a single flashing green button on his console. They never learned, Vance whispered. A protector does not leave his flock in the field when the wolves come. Weeks ago, long before the Draken fleet arrived, Vance had issued a quiet zero-trace order. The 12 million citizens of Mars and the 4 million on Europa had been quietly moved. They had descended into the deep-core radiation-shielded bunkers buried miles beneath the surface. They were safe. What they left behind was not a city. It was a kill box. On Mars, the dormant industrial complexes suddenly roared to life. General Vorg spun around as a massive autonomous ore crusher, a machine the size of a city block, suddenly shifted its treads. Its towering hydraulic arms designed to shatter bedrock swung outward with terrifying speed. It didn't fire a laser. It didn't shoot plasma. It simply swung 1,000 tons of solid steels directly into the Draken infantry lines. Hundreds of soldiers were crushed in an instant. Ambush! Vorg roared, firing his plasma rifle at the machine. The plasma scarred the heavy industrial plating, but the machine didn't feel pain. It didn't care. All across the Martian plain, the infrastructure turned into an army of mechanical nightmares. Automated drilling rigs breached the surface right beneath the Draken troop formations, dragging screaming soldiers down into the subterranean dark. High-pressure methane vents used for atmospheric processing ignited simultaneously, creating walls of fire that incinerated entire battalions. It was not a battle. It was an extermination. The Draken troops were trained to fight soldiers. They had no idea how to fight an entire industrial zone that had been programmed to murder them. Fall back, Vorg screamed, panic finally shattering his arrogant facade. He watched his elite shock troops being ground into paste by automated conveyor belts and construction drones. Get back to the transports. Get us off this rock. But as the Draken soldiers scrambled for the safety of their dropships, the human targeting algorithms executed their final command. Hidden charges buried beneath the landing pads detonated. The explosions were not designed to vaporize the ships. They were designed to cripple the repulsor lifts. The heavy Draken transports slumped into the red dirt, grounded permanently. General Vorg stood in the burning dust of Mars, surrounded by the screaming remnants of his army. He looked up at the sky, his yellow eyes wide with absolute terror. He was trapped. And on the ice moon of Europa, the exact same nightmare was unfolding. The Draken forces had landed their heavy walkers on the thick ice sheets, preparing to breach the subterranean oceans where they believed the humans were hiding. But humanity had spent decades mastering the thermal dynamics of Europa's crust. As the Draken forces marched to the center of the ice plains, automated submersibles beneath the surface detonated highly localized thermal charges. They didn't blow up the Draken troops. They melted the ice right out from under them. Entire legions of Draken armor plunged into the freezing, pitch-black abyss of the European Ocean, swallowed by the deep without firing a single shot. High above the slaughter in the orbital space of the Sol system, Admiral Vane listened to the frantic, dying screams of his ground forces over the comms. He was frozen in his command chair. His mind simply could not process the data. An hour ago, he was the commander of the most feared armada in the galaxy. Now his fleet was bleeding, his ground army was annihilated, and he hadn't even engaged a human warship in direct combat yet. "Admiral," the Draken comms officer whispered, his hands shaking violently over his console. "General Vorg's signal is gone. The Martian vanguard is lost. The European detachment is... They're just gone, sir." Vane stared blankly at the screen. He had lost. He had brought 800 ships to conquer a primitive rock, and the primitives had dismantled him with mining tools and math. "We leave," Vane said, his voice hollow, devoid of all its former arrogance. "Recall the orbital platforms. Spool the FTL drives. We return to Draka Prime. We will tell the Emperor. We will tell him to seal the borders. We cannot fight them." "Admiral!" The sensor officer suddenly shrieked, a sound of pure, unadulterated horror. "Slipspace ruptures directly ahead." Vane jerked his head up. "What? Who?" "It can't be their fleet. They only have 30 ships." "It's them, sir. But the energy signatures, they're wrong." Out of the blackness of space, 36 human warships materialized. But they were no longer the rusted patchwork freighters that Vane had faced weeks ago. Captain Silas Thorne sat in the center chair of the Aegis. He held a fresh cup of coffee. He was not smiling. He looked like a man who was about to finish a dirty, exhausting job. Over the past 3 weeks, humanity had not just been hiding. They had been working. When they destroyed the Draken vanguard, they didn't just leave the wreckage to float in the void. Human salvage teams had descended on the Draken debris like locusts. They tore apart the Draken FTL drives. They dissected the Draken communication arrays. They reverse-engineered the Draken shield emitters. And because they were human, they didn't just copy the alien technology. They optimized it. They fixed its flaws. They made it better. The 36 human ships that dropped out of hyperspace in front of Admiral Vane were now equipped with advanced Draken shielding, modified human kinetic mass drivers, and jump drives that spooled in half the time of the original alien models. They had stolen the fire of the gods, and they were bringing it back to burn down Olympus. "They're broadcasting on our command frequencies," the Draken comms officer stammered. "They broke our encryption. Admiral, they know every move we're going to make before we make it." Captain Thorne's voice suddenly filled the bridge of the Draken flagship. The transmission was crystal clear, overriding Vane's own security lockouts. "Admiral Vane," Thorne said, his gravelly voice echoing off the gleaming bulkheads. "I told you to turn around. You didn't listen." Vane gritted his teeth, his pride fighting a losing battle against his terror. "You think 36 ships can stop me, Thorne? I still have over 500 warships. I will grind you into dust." Thorne took a slow sip of his coffee. The sound was perfectly audible over the channel. "I don't need to stop you, Admiral," Thorne said quietly. "I just need to keep you busy." Before Vane could process the meaning of those words, the human fleet attacked. They did not fight like a traditional navy. They fought like a pack of wolves that had cornered a wounded bear. They used their new upgraded jump drives to execute micro-jumps, teleporting just a few thousand kilometers at a time. A human destroyer would vanish instantly, reappearing directly behind a Draken battleship. It would fire a point-blank kinetic slug through the Draken engines, then micro-jump away before the enemy could even pivot their turrets. It was a massacre. The Draken fleet was massive, but it was blind, sluggish, and terrified. They were firing wildly into the dark, hitting their own ships in the confusion, while the humans danced through the chaos, executing precise, lethal strikes. Inside Cheyenne Mountain, General Vance watched the tactical map. The Draken fleet in the Sol system was being systematically dismantled. But Vance's eyes were not on the defense of Earth. His eyes were fixed on a small, encrypted subroutine running in the corner of his monitor. The true purpose of Thorne's assault was not to win the space battle. Thorne was a distraction. "Status on Vanguard Team Actual," Vance asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. "They are away, General," the analyst replied. "The reverse-engineered stealth drives are holding. The Draken fleet is entirely focused on Captain Thorne. They never saw the dropship slip past them." Vance nodded slowly. He had not just stolen the enemy's shields and engines. He had stolen their navigation charts. He knew exactly where Draka Prime was. He knew exactly where Emperor Moros sat on his throne of melted armor. While Admiral Vane was fighting for his life in the ruins of the solar system, a small elite strike force of human special operatives equipped with cloaking tech the Draken didn't even know was possible, was currently hurtling through hyperspace, heading straight for the heart of the Draken Empire. "Hold the line, Silas," Vance murmured, looking at the blinking lights of Thorne's fleet. "Just hold them a little longer." In space, Captain Thorne set his empty coffee mug down. The bridge of the Aegis was shaking violently as enemy plasma splashed harmlessly against their new upgraded shields. "Target their command carriers," Thorne ordered, his eyes locked on the burning wreckage of the alien fleet. "Do not let a single one of them jump out of this system. We finish this here." The 36 ships of Earth roared into the fire, a tiny unbreakable wall of steel and spite, ready to make the galaxy remember why you never ever threaten humanity's home. The vacuum of space does not care about courage. It does not respect defiance. It is a cold mathematical void where mass and energy dictate the survival of the fittest. For the first 30 minutes of the counterattack, the 36 human warships danced a flawless, deadly ballet. They used their reverse-engineered micro-jump drives to bleed the Draken armada. They struck from the shadows crippled capital ships and vanished before the enemy targeting computers could lock on. But a pack of wolves, no matter how clever, cannot bite a glacier to death. Admiral Vane, humiliated and desperate, finally stopped trying to outmaneuver the humans. He realized the sheer brutal advantage he still held. He had 500 operational warships left. "Form the phalanx," Vane ordered, his voice devoid of anger, replaced by a cold survivalist dread. "Lock shields, overlap the firing arcs, do not chase them. Let them break their teeth on our hull." The Draken fleet collapsed inward. They formed a massive, impenetrable sphere of dark metal and overlapping plasma shields. They became a floating fortress, and then they began to move forward, a slow, grinding juggernaut aimed directly at the inner Sol system. They were going to crush Earth, not with tactics, but with gravity and fire. On the bridge of the Aegis, the tactical map shifted from a chaotic scramble to a solid, terrifying wall of red. The ship shuddered violently. A glancing blow from a Draken heavy plasma battery had clipped their upgraded kinetic shields. The lights on the bridge flickered. Sparks rained down from the overhead conduits. The smell of ozone and burning copper filled the cramped space. "Shields are at 40%, Elena, the young communications officer, called out. Her voice was tight, strained to the breaking point. She was wiping blood from a gash on her forehead, but her hands never left the console. "Captain, we can't dent that formation. Our kinetic slugs are detonating against their overlapped barriers. We are losing momentum." Captain Silas Thorne stood by his command chair. He did not brace himself against the rocking deck. He simply watched the main view screen. The Draken phalanx was a wall of blinding light, spitting relentless death into the void. To his left, the tactical board chimed a harsh, flat tone. The human destroyer Defiance simply vanished from the grid, caught in a crossfire of overlapping plasma beams, its shields overloaded. The ship cracked open like a brittle shell, its crew exposed to the absolute zero of space in a fraction of a second. 300 men and women. Gone. Thorne felt the loss like a physical weight settling into his chest. He had known the captain of the Defiance. They had played poker at the naval yards. He knew his wife's name. Another chime. The heavy cruiser ironclad. Engines disabled, drifting into the Draken kill zone. "They're adapting," Thorne said softly. His voice was a low rumble beneath the blaring claxons. He looked at the tactical display. He saw the heart of the Draken formation. 4 massive super dreadnoughts formed the anchor of the enemy shield grid. They were projecting an interdiction field, a localized gravity well that was slowly shutting down the human's ability to microjump. The snare was tightening. In 10 minutes, the human fleet would be pinned. In 15, they would be vaporized. "Captain," Elena said, her voice dropping to a whisper. She looked up from her screen, her eyes wide, realizing the same mathematical certainty. "We are out of time." Thorne looked at the young officer. He looked at his helmsman, gripping the controls with white knuckles. He looked at the faces of his bridge crew. They were exhausted, battered, staring down the throat of inevitable death. But nobody was running. Nobody was screaming. They were just doing their jobs. Thorne walked over to the comm station. "Elena, open a fleet-wide channel. Override all local comms. Put me in their ears." Elena swallowed hard. She tapped the console. "You're live, Captain." Thorne took a breath. The air smelled of smoke and sweat. "This is Captain Thorne." His voice echoed through the bridge of every remaining human ship. It played in the engine rooms where mechanics desperately patched ruptured coolant lines. It played in the med bays where surgeons worked under flickering emergency lights. "The enemy has formed a defensive anchor," Thorne said, his voice steady, carrying the gravity of a man who had made his peace. "They think they can wait us out. They think they can crush us with their weight." He paused. He looked at the red wall on the screen. "I'm going to take the Aegis and break their anchor. I am going to spool the FTL drive and jump directly into the center of their formation. When I detonate their shield generators, the grid will fall. That is when you hit them. You hit them with everything you have." The channel was silent. Every commander in the fleet knew what a point-blank jump into a shielded formation meant. "I am not going to lie to you," Thorne continued, his voice dropping an octave heavy with truth. "This is a one-way trip. Some of us are not going to come back." He looked around his own bridge. He met Elena's eyes. He met the helmsman's eyes. "I am not ordering anyone to follow me," Thorne said. "If you break off now, you can survive. You can run to the outer colonies. But the people behind us, the 8 billion souls on that blue marble, they cannot run. They are our mothers, our fathers, our children." He gripped the edge of the console. His knuckles went white. "They deserve a chance. They deserve to wake up tomorrow. That is the burden of the uniform. That is what makes us human." Thorne stood tall. "I promise you this. The Draken Empire will never threaten our home again. Make them remember us." Thorne cut the channel. He turned to his helmsman. "Set coordinates for the center of the Draken interdiction anchor." The helmsman didn't hesitate. His hands flew across the keypad. "Coordinates locked, Captain." "Captain," Elena said softly. Thorne turned. The young officer was standing at attention. Tears tracked through the soot on her cheeks, but her chin was high. "Incoming transmissions, sir," Elena said, her voice trembling with a fierce, unbreakable pride. "From the fleet." Thorne looked at the tactical board. The remaining human ships were not breaking off. They were not running. The cruiser Retribution shifted its vector, falling in directly beside the Aegis. The frigate Spearhead moved to their starboard flank. One by one, the 33 remaining ships of the Earth Defense Fleet broke their evasive patterns and formed a single Titan spearhead round Thorne's flagship. They were not going to let him go alone. Thorne felt a tightening in his throat. He swallowed it down. He looked at the view screen. "Divert all auxiliary power to the structural integrity field," Thorne ordered. His voice was a whip crack now. The time for solemnity was over. The time for violence had arrived. Root life support route and artificial gravity. Give everything to the FTL capacitors. The lights on the Aegis went completely dark. The bridge was lit only by the red glow of the tactical monitors and the blinding flashes of plasma fire outside the viewport. "Capacitors at maximum yield," the engineering officer shouted in the dark. "Brace for jump," Thorne commanded. He didn't sit down. He stood in the center of the bridge, his feet planted, wide, his eyes fixed on the heart of the enemy armada. "Execute." The Aegis did not fly forward. Space simply tore open around them. The human spearhead vanished from normal space, bypassing the overlapping exterior shields of the Draken phalanx, crossing thousands of miles in a fraction of a millisecond. They materialized directly inside the heart of the enemy formation. It was a suicidal maneuver. They were surrounded by 500 warships at point-blank range with no room to maneuver. But they didn't need to maneuver. Fire! The human ships unleashed a devastating omnidirectional barrage. At this range, targeting sensors were useless. Every kinetic slug, every high-yield torpedo they fired slammed instantly into the unshielded interior hulls of the Draken dreadnoughts. The anchor ships of the Draken interdiction field were ripped apart from the inside out. Their massive plasma reactors breached, creating localized supernovas that cascaded through the tightly packed Draken formation. The shock waves hammered the Aegis. The sound of tearing metal screamed through the hull. "Hull integrity failing," Elena shouted, clinging to her console as the deck pitched violently. "We've lost the port engines. Primary armor is gone." "Keep firing," Thorn roared over the deafening noise. "Do not stop until the guns melt." The Aegis was dying. Its armor was peeling away like dead skin. Fires raged through the lower decks. But the massive kinetic railguns on its bow continued to cycle, driving depleted uranium slugs through the bridge of a Draken carrier, shattering it into a million pieces of frozen shrapnel. Outside the viewport, the Draken fleet was eating itself alive. With their anchor destroyed and their formation violently disrupted from within, the alien ships collided with one another. Their overlapping shields became a liability, crushing their own hulls as they tried to break away from the human suicide strike. Admiral Vane's flagship, the Eclipse, was caught in the chain reaction. A Draken cruiser, spinning out of control with its engines blown, slammed broadside into Vane's dreadnought. The impact shattered the Eclipse's spine. Vane was thrown against the bulkhead. He tasted copper. He looked out the shattered viewport of his dying ship and saw the Aegis. The human flagship was little more than a burning skeleton. It was leaking atmosphere, venting plasma, its hull blackened and cracked. Yet it still pushed forward. It refused to die. In that final moment, looking at the sheer terrifying willpower of the human vessel, Vane finally understood Ambassador Zael's warning. You cannot conquer a species that is willing to burn itself to the ground just to ensure you burn with them. The Eclipse's reactor went critical. The Draken flagship vanished in a blinding sphere of white heat. The shockwave hit the Aegis. Thorn was thrown to the deck. The tactical monitors exploded in a shower of sparks. The artificial gravity failed, leaving the bridge crew floating in the dark, tethered only by their crash webbing. The terrible, deafening roar of the battle was suddenly replaced by the eerie, absolute silence of the void as the bridge vented its atmosphere. Thorn drifted in the dark. He felt cold, so incredibly cold. He looked out the cracked, reinforced glass of the main viewport. The red wall was gone. The Draken armada was broken. Burning hulks drifted aimlessly against the backdrop of the stars. The mighty empire had been shattered into scrap metal. Thorn closed his eyes. He had kept his promise. Half a galaxy away. The sky above Draka Prime was bleeding. Emperor Moros stood on the grand balcony of his obsidian palace. He gripped the stone railing with massive scaled hands, his yellow eyes wide with a horrific realization. The capital city was not burning. The civilian sectors, the grand markets, the towering residential spires, they were completely untouched. But the horizon was ringed with fire. The orbital defense grid had been silenced. The grand shipyards, which had birthed the greatest armada in galactic history, were tumbling out of the sky in flaming ruins. The primary military communications hub, the fortress armories, the planetary shield generators, every single instrument of Draken military power was being systematically, surgically dismantled. It was not a bombardment. It was an assassination. "Where are they?" Moros roared, turning back toward his throne room. His royal guard, 20 of the most lethal warriors in the Empire, stood with their weapons drawn, scanning the shadows. "Where is the fleet? How did they bypass the perimeter?" There was no warning klaxon. There was no sound of dropships breaching the atmosphere. The massive iron-wrought doors of the throne room simply blew inward. They didn't explode with fire. They were hit with a kinetic shockwave so precise, so overwhelmingly powerful, that the 50-ton doors were ripped from their hinges and thrown across the polished obsidian floor. The Royal Guard raised their plasma rifles. They never fired a shot. From the smoke and the dust of the shattered entryway, small cylindrical devices rolled across the floor. They detonated with a blinding flash of hard light and a concussive wave of non-lethal sonic force. The Royal Guards, bred for war, armored in heavy plates, simply collapsed. Their nervous systems were instantly overloaded. They hit the floor paralyzed, gasping for air, unable to move a single muscle. Emperor Moros backed away, his hands reaching for the massive ceremonial broadsword mounted behind his throne. Footsteps echoed in the silent hall, heavy, deliberate boots on polished stone. Through the lingering smoke walked General Harlan Vance. He was not wearing power armor. He was not wielding a massive energy weapon. He wore the standard dark green dress uniform of the Earth Defense Command. 4 silver stars gleamed on his collar. His gray hair was neatly cropped. His face was a mask of cold, immovable stone. Behind him walked a squad of human special operatives. They moved like ghosts, their armor entirely black, their weapons raised and locked onto the Emperor's chest. They did not shout. They did not gloat. They secured the perimeter with terrifying mechanical efficiency. Vance stopped at the base of the throne. He looked up at the towering alien emperor. Moros was twice his size, a creature of nightmare and violence. But in that moment, Vance was the largest thing in the room. Moros gripped the hilt of his broadsword, his scales flushed with dark, angry blood. "You," Moros snarled, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and profound disbelief. "You are the primitive. You are the insect." Vance kept his hands clasped behind his back. "I am General Harlan Vance," he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a dying star. "And I am the man who just took your empire apart." Moros bared his fangs. "You think you have won? I will tear you to pieces with my bare hands. I will." "You will do nothing," Vance interrupted. He didn't raise his voice, but the absolute certainty in his tone stopped the Emperor dead. Vance stepped up the first stair of the dais. "Look out your window, Moros. Your shipyards are gone. Your defense grid is scrap. I have stealth cruisers in high orbit with kinetic rods aimed directly at the fault lines beneath this continent. If I give the order, this planet cracks in half." Vane stepped up the second stair. "You sent 800 ships to burn my home. You sent an army to slaughter my people. Under your own laws, under the laws of the Draken Empire, I should execute you right now. I should glass your cities. I should take your children and put them in chains." Moros swallowed. The broadsword felt heavy in his hands. He looked into the eyes of the human. He expected to see bloodlust. He expected to see the savage, feral rage of a conquered species seeking revenge. He saw nothing but pity. "But I am not you," Vance said softly. He reached the top of the dais. He stood toe-to-toe with the monster that had terrorized the galaxy. "We study war, Moros. We know it intimately. We know the smell of burning cities. We know the weight of mass graves. We spent 5,000 years butchering each other. We learned the hardest lesson in the universe." Vance pointed a single finger at the Emperor's chest. "Killing your enemy does not make you strong. It just leaves you alone in a graveyard." Vance lowered his hand. He turned his back on the Emperor, walking slowly down the steps. "You are going to order your remaining forces to stand down. You are going to sign a treaty of unconditional surrender. You will release every world you hold in bondage. And if I refuse," Moros whispered, his pride fracturing. Vance stopped. He looked over his shoulder. "If you refuse, I leave. And I let the galaxy do to you what you have done to them for 1,000 years. Without your fleet, how long do you think your empire survives the vengeance of your slaves?" Moros dropped the sword. It clattered loudly against the stone. The Emperor of 100 worlds sank to his knees. "What do you want from us?" Moros asked, his voice broken hollow. "We are going to send you teachers," Vance said, walking toward the shattered doors. "We are going to send you engineers and doctors and builders. We are going to teach you how to live without a boot on someone else's neck. You are going to learn how to be civilized." Vance stepped out into the burning light of the Draken sky. "Welcome to the new era, Emperor." 3 months later, the dust had settled, the treaties were signed, the Draken Empire was no more replaced by a provisional republic monitored by the Earth Defense Command. The galaxy, for the first time in millennia, took a deep collective breath of peace. But peace always demands a toll. On Earth, a cold wind blew across the green lawns of Arlington. The sky was a brilliant pale blue. The sun shone down on the rows of pristine white marble. They had built a new wall. It was forged from the salvaged hull plating of the Draken dreadnoughts. Dark, heavy, and polished to a mirror finish. Etched into the dark metal were 4,200 names. The Quito, Captain Silas Thorne, stood before the wall. He wore his dress uniform. His chest was heavy with medals he didn't want pinned there by politicians who didn't understand. His left arm was in a sling, his face scarred from the explosive decompression on the bridge of the Aegis. He stood in the quiet. The only sound was the rustle of the wind through the old oak trees. He traced a finger over the letters etched into the steel. Commander John Hayes, Communications Officer Elena Rostova, Ensign, so many names, so many young lives burned away in the dark so that the world could keep spinning in the light. Thorne reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a battered, heavily scorched ceramic mug. He unscrewed the cap of a steel thermos he had tucked under his good arm. He poured the steaming black coffee into the mug. He didn't drink it. He knelt down, his joints aching, and placed the mug gently at the base of the wall right beneath Hayes's name. "Rest easy, John," Thorne whispered, his voice catching in his throat. He cleared it. He stood up straight. "We held the line." He stood at attention. He raised his good hand and delivered a slow, perfectly crisp salute to the cold steel. High above the memorial in the quiet halls of the Galactic Council, Ambassador Ziel addressed the assembly. The room was different now. The arrogance was gone. The predatory sneers were gone. The representatives of 47 species sat in reverent, absolute silence. Ziel looked at the holographic map of the galaxy. It was no longer dominated by the red borders of the Draken Empire. The borders were open. Trade routes were flourishing. Relief ships bearing the blue flag of Earth were moving across the quadrant, rebuilding the worlds that the Draken had broken. "They warned us," Ziel said, his voice echoing softly in the great hall. "They told us they were monsters. They told us they were born in fire." Ziel looked down at his podium. "But we misunderstood the fire. We thought it was meant to consume us." He looked up, meeting the eyes of every alien delegate in the room. They did not conquer the Draken. They dismantled them. They took the greatest military power in galactic history, broke its sword, and then offered it a hand to stand back up. They showed us that true power is not the ability to destroy a world. Ziel smiled, a profound sense of awe settling over his old features. True power is having the absolute capacity to destroy your enemy and choosing to build them a hospital instead. The galaxy had learned its lesson. They looked out into the dark toward that small blue marble on the outer rim, and they no longer saw a primitive species. They no longer saw easy prey. They saw the apex. They saw the shield. The universe is a dark, cold place. It is filled with predators. It is filled with empires that want to consume the weak, but the weak do not have to hide anymore, because now they know the truth. When the night is darkest, when the monsters are at the door, when you have nowhere left to run and the sky is falling down, when you call for help, humans will come. Always.